packet, in your packet, there was the update outline, which I passed out a paper copy. Contained in the packet was the PowerPoint we're going to go through, as well as the update. This is a work product that Mr. Robertson and Mr. Whitehouse have assisted us with, and I am hopeful this is our last presentation before we move to ordinance drafting. Recall, this was the top priority of the County Council's update when it came to our ordinance writing, and we've been before you a couple of times identifying what we were hoping to accomplish with the perimeter buffer update. We've received some feedback and direction that is really contained in this document, which for all intent and purposes is going to be the roadmap to what will become the ordinance. So we will highlight the parameters by which the outline has information. If you have anything specifically that you're concerned with or question, please let us know. Eventually, Mr. Robertson will have that task in front of him to draft the ordinance, to which we'll be back to introduce and hopefully keep this thing moving. Okay, so I kind of covered this. This is the top-ranked priority for the council. Last time I was here, I gave you a high-level update on what we were attempting to accomplish with this new ordinance, and got some feedback from you. And now we've really given specifics in this this presentation, as well as the document I keep referencing, which, unless we hear otherwise, we are poised to move into the ordinance drafting at this point. So the document starts with, it's broken down in sections, and it does start with the definition section. Within the definition section, we do have 6 specific updates, which are either in need of updating in today's code or are not even referenced in today's code. So terminologies on the screen are what's inside the document. The document, as you can tell, it goes into much more specificity related to the definitions of these terms. Going into the specifics of what we aim to see in the perimeter buffer, we start with Section 2, which is called the Perimeter Buffer General Standards. And this really is what hopefully we think will improve what we're seeing out when it comes to land use and subdivision and RPCs that fall under perimeter buffers, including the fact that we are going to use 30-foot in width for the perimeter buffer and a 20-foot buffer to that buffer, which we hope will give the space needed to protect the area that we're calling the perimeter buffer in the case of when woodlands are present, protecting those existing trees. When
the perimeter buffer protection area is 20 feet?
That's correct.
Okay. Is that number doesn't appear on line 88, so I'm not sure how we know that that's going to be the number.
Thank you. My attorney tells me in the definitions it's defined in line 29, perimeter buffer area, an area adjacent to the perimeter buffer that contains woodlands that is not less than 20 feet in width measured from the edge of the perimeter buffer.
That's why we pay him the big bucks.
There you go. Bails me out again. So the idea is the perimeter buffer is going to be a standard 30-foot, and then the 20-foot area of protection up against that when woodlands exist. There's many ways to create a area between the buffer. You may hear the term drip line. We didn't go in that direction. We use 30 feet because, quite frankly, 20 feet because 30 plus 20 is 50, and that's the buffer size for our resource buffer standards in most instances. So if we wanted to have a greater area, that's certainly feedback that we will receive in the ordinance writing and then the public hearing for the ordinance. And I'm certain there's going to be calls for greater area protection, but we're going to leave that final decision up to you guys. It will be in the ordinance as 30 plus 20 unless you tell us otherwise for the ordinance drafting exercise. Back to the slide here, the standards for the perimeter buffer, listing trees and shrubs, local and native species. We've included the ANSI A300 standards. That's something that we didn't have before. 70% and 30% breakdown, that's currently in code, so we're just codifying that. 15 trees per 100, that's the same. All trees and shrubs must be 6 feet in height at the time of planting and obtain a minimum height of 6 feet. That's an additional standard that doesn't exist today. Buffer can include existing woodlands and planted trees. We're being very specific that you can use existing woodlands. In fact, you'll see here in a minute that there's incentives, we hope, for developers to maintain woods and use those woodlands as the perimeter buffer. Of course, if there's a resource on the piece of property where we've had the resource buffer updated recently, that resource buffer takes precedent over and is not in addition to the perimeter buffer that we're talking about today. So if you have a 100-foot buffer on a resource, that would take precedent. You would still remain at 100 feet. And then the standards will include signage to mark the perimeter buffer, something that doesn't happen today in all cases. Mr. Hudson, question, or are you getting ready?
I'm just
Okay.
good.
I saw your look. So something that we went over very carefully if you think back to the workshop, the fact that not all perimeter buffers are the same, and it really starts with the development of the piece of property and whether woodlands are inexistent at the time of the development or if there is no woodlands. Not all developments happen where their woodlands exist. Some do happen on what we would call ag fields where there aren't any woodlands. So it really takes you on a path of what to do related to the perimeter buffer. I'm going to start with if there's a piece of property that has existing woodlands to be used for that perimeter buffer. And this is where we're hoping to build in some incentives to make sure that those woodlands remain. So if there is woodlands present, we are going to require a forest assessment by a certified professional to tell the county what type of forest or woods are present. The woodlands will be shown on the site plan and landscape plan. Woodlands shall remain in their natural state with very limited activity within. Sometimes where woods exist today, there is activity that takes place that is detrimental to the health of the trees and shrubs. The perimeter buffer woodlands will be protected by that area that I was referencing earlier. We call it buffering the buffer, the 20-foot protection area. The buffer and protection area will be fenced off and marked during construction, something Mr. Schaefer has asked for, where we put a fence in the property so folks that are out there doing site work know not to go within the fence and destroy the woodlands or the shrubs and natural setting behind the fence. Selective clearing and removal of invasive species and dead trees in the woodlands is permitted. That's the same standard that we have with the resource buffer. If there are things that can be removed because they're invasive, they should be. Walking trails, of course, are permitted and encouraged in woodlands. Access point to those woodlands for the buffer maintenance is permitted. Any removal or damage of trees within the woodlands is subject to the mitigation requirements, which we'll highlight in a minute. And then woodlands grounds is forbidden to be cleared, graded, or grubbed, something that we see sometimes now where mistake or not mistake, heavy equipment go inside the buffer area and really impact that area and the trees within.
So removal and damage of trees, is that just prior to the completion of the development, or is that in perpetuity? Or
We see that as in perpetuity. If a tree becomes unhealthy, and really if it's a safety issue, you should be allowed to remove it and come in and.
HOA is responsible, or at some point?
At some point, there's a handshake point where it moves from developer to HOA, and yes, that responsibility would move as well. So once it gets into the hands of the HOA's responsibility, yes, they would be allowed to, under these rules, remove the tree or clear out any dead tree, or even if it's for limited clearing for the view shed, if that's something that would be permitted in certain cases, yes, they could be allowed to do that. again, under the purview of the Planning and Zoning Department, they'd come in and ask to have that done. So here's one of the bigger incentives, and one of the things that we talked about throughout this initiative is, what do we do to try to keep woods that are being used for the perimeter buffer in place and not destroyed for the sake of the development? This is what we've created, where if there is woodlands, we're having a 5-year look back. And that 5-year look back is hopefully the incentive for the developer not to go into that 30-foot area and keep the trees. Everyone would agree that existing healthy trees create a better perimeter buffer than trees that are planted and take 20 to 30 years to grow to any height. So I gave a demonstration in our last presentation. I'm not going to do it here, but what we're doing is we're creating this area called the cleared area that makes up the perimeter buffer. In essence, that's the 30 feet that if they have gone inside the perimeter buffer of 30 feet and cleared that up to the property line, we're going to measure that area. And we're going to make them plant that back 2 times the size of what they've taken down. So if trees are in existence within 5 years are cleared, and you go inside the perimeter buffer and clear the trees, then you're going to be required to replant trees at the amount of 2 times what you've cleared. So if you knock down an acre of trees, you're going to be required to plant 2 acres of trees. Okay?
Does that include the depth also? 2 times the depth?
No, you're going to have to plant 30 feet if you've gone into the 30 feet. So 30 feet remains the standard, but if you've knocked down an acre of trees in that 30 feet, you're going to have to plant 2 acres of trees somewhere else. Or just make the 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet to create a bigger buffer to get to your 2 acres.
So I'm be clear on this, they could potentially clear right up to the property line and then plant trees somewhere else?
No. If they choose, first of all, 5-year look back, you've knocked down the trees within 5 years inside the perimeter buffer. And you still knock down the trees if there are trees on the property outside the perimeter buffer, of course, to put in your site work and your infrastructure. But if you clear the 30 feet buffer of trees, then you're going to have to plant those trees back, and you're going to have to plant double what you knocked down. So find acreage somewhere else on that property to plant trees or keep trees. Or, in essence, we say you can do that somewhere outside of that parcel. If you skip down to the bottom, you can choose to replant trees or protect trees off-site as well in the same HUCK 12, or if it's on the property that you're developing, it has to be protected under perpetual conservation easement. So you can do it on-site or off-site. Double the size.
No, I'll be honest, one of the bits of feedback I get from people is that the county has these rules and guidelines, but we don't have a lot of enforcement power. I always just tell them to talk to Doug Hudson. But that is a complaint, that they're like, you guys, you tell them they can't do this, they do it anyway, and I don't see any penalties for them. So.
Exactly.
You're right. Something Mr. Hudson has said along the way through this initiative is we've got to put penalties in place to get people's attention. And
that's what I was getting ready for. Yeah.
Stay tuned. We'll get to the end of the penalty section, and it does speak to that. We have limited penalties and violations in today's code, and certainly it does not incentivize people. You're allowed to knock down trees if you have to.
Right.
In this instance, if this gets passed, the incentive is not to knock down trees, and we don't have that in today's code.
Perfect example is that it's better to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Right.
At times.
Correct.
So we want to get rid of that.
It's something I have to be clear about. This is in a situation that we've all been made familiar with, where trees exist, and you've knocked down the trees within 5 years of asking to have the trees developed. Only in the perimeter buffer. If you have 100 acres of full trees and you knock down everything up to the 30 feet perimeter buffer, that's a different conversation. That's not what we're proposing here. We're only talking about protecting the perimeter buffer. I know there's been conversation about a tree ordinance. This was our first priority. We're going to do this one, and then we may have that discussion in the future to worry about the other trees on the property. Okay, we jumped around a little bit. I'll start off by looking towards the top, where we are asking to have things planted at 2 times the size of what was cleared, 50 trees per acre, that's a greater density. Again, you still have to have a 30-foot buffer no matter what you decide to plant. So the perimeter buffer will always remain 30 feet. We continue to have the standards that are listed in Section 2 of what has to be planted and meeting those standards. So nothing really changes in the perimeter buffer if the trees get knocked down, except we're hoping that this will incentivize them not to knock the trees down by having to plant twice as much area and twice as much trees. I did mention that another thought, we could allow them to replant property other than the one harvested off-site, but we're keeping that within the HUCK 12. That's a defined area that we used at the resource buffer. It's really an area that is nearby the property. It's not too far away, and it's defined by the USGS. If you protect property within the development, it's going to be protected with a perpetual conservation easement. And then again, 2 times the area will be replanted. Everyone okay with that? Moving forward? You understand what we're saying? Okay. Then, of course, as explained in the workshop and then through these additional presentations, there's areas that don't have trees at all and that get developed. That's pretty straightforward. Without trees, you've got to plant a perimeter buffer. You've got to plant it to the standards that we've listed here. You've got to have a landscape plan. You've got to make sure the trees are planted correctly through the ANSI standards. You've got to make sure the trees and shrubs grow and stay growing. And it's the developer's responsibilities for 2 years to ensure that those trees and shrubs remain healthy. At some point, there will be a handover point. Then it'll be the HOA's responsibility in perpetuity to ensure the perimeter buffers remain healthy.
Can I ask a question?
Certainly.
Line 168 talked about the 2-year period that the developer is going to be responsible to remain healthy.
168, yes.
On page 6. Mm-hmm. Is that language a little loose? What does 2-year guarantee mean?
Yes, this is not what an ordinance would say.
Okay.
But we want to be clear that the perimeter buffer will have a 2-year guarantee secured by bonding from the time of substantial completion. So,
and what happens? He goes back in. He replants the dead vegetation, shrubs, or trees, and they die again because he didn't water them at the 2 years. You know, you're at 23 months. He replants. You get a drought. They die again. What happens then?
I think the intent was, I'm asking our lawyer to bail us out again, but I think the intent is that, well,
at that point, we wouldn't release the bond. They'd have to come in and replant the ones that died in the 23rd month, because we're still holding that bond for 2 years after substantial completion.
What if they're dead in 36 months?
Well, in 36 months, then it's on the HOA or whomever at that point. So, I mean, because we're not in the business, whether it's sidewalks or streets or whatever, we're not in the business of guaranteeing that sort of thing in perpetuity. At some point, there has to be a cutoff for the county.
Is it typical for a control to pass the HOA within 2 years?
It depends. And I don't want to say that it is or is not. What we looked at to try to extend it as much as possible to make sure that the trees would live is that you have to plant them before the first building permit. So that gets you a really early date to get trees in the ground. Then you're going to be building houses and everything else. Then county engineering or P&Z's staff are going to go out and inspect to give you substantial completion once everything's done in that section. And then the 2 years start. So it's really probably going to end up being, several years from building permit to substantial completion, then 2 years after that. Because the idea is we want to get these trees established.
Well, that brings up another. Go ahead. Okay. Say they've got to plant them prior to the first building permit, but that's by phase, correct? That's not the entire subdivision?
That's correct. That's by phase. And we're not going to let you start the next phase until the prior one's planted, et cetera. So, yeah. Yep. The issue is, too, we thought about making it the entire subdivision, but on larger subdivisions, you can't even get back, say in the back of it, if that's, the later phase, you wouldn't even be able to physically get back there to plant the trees or inspect them or whatever else, because you got to put the streets and roads and everything in the first phases to work your way back. Because sort of logically you think, well, why wouldn't we just say put the buffer in day one, but just as a practical matter, it just doesn't work that way.
Thanks, Vince. And recall the workshop and other illustrations we've showed before. There was no plan to have these buffers installed at a certain time. And let's be clear, these buffers are mostly screening and filtering of what's on the other side of the buffer. It's very minimum water quality, very minimum habitat creation. This is just to filter out views and what's on the other side of this property, whether it be some other activity or other homes or someone that's now looking at houses coming to their backyard. So we wanted to make sure that the perimeter buffer's in place when the houses go in place. And we saw some pictures of development where there wasn't a perimeter buffer and the houses were already up and being lived in, and perimeter buffers coming way after that. So by having what Mr. Robertson described as shrubs and trees and perimeter buffers planted along in sequence before the houses come, the thought is that there'll be something growing and creating that filtration by the time someone moves into a house. And we do that by phase. Certainly some of the larger developments take many years to see the last phase as compared to the first phase. And we're hoping that the perimeter buffers are up and growing by that time. Okay, let's talk about the landscape plan. Again, additional requirements that may exist today in our code, but certainly they're not as strong as we're proposing in this ordinance update. So we're going to require a plan for all subdivisions or all developments, and the plan will include all these requirements. The approximate location of the protective fencing, location, space, and height of the species of new trees and shrubs that will be planted, location of the perimeter buffer signage, measures to avoid sedimentation, intrusions, and erosion, summary table of all the new trees to be planted and existing trees to be retained, a note confirming the full cost of replacement for the trees and shrubs will be on the landscape plan. The planning schedule, that's what we were talking about before. So if you're going to phase out a development, you're also going to have to phase in the perimeter buffer. That planning schedule will be listed clearly on the landscape plan. The perimeter buffer by phase must be planted prior to the residential building permits for that respective phase. It's what we just referenced. And that's by phase. So all of phase one has to be planted and installed before phase two can be released. And then miscellaneous clause allowing the Plan Zoning Commission to approve a plan with other features. That is actually in today's code where they're talking about perimeter buffer requirements, especially the buffers that are on DelDOT roads. Okay, timing, bonds, and guarantees. We've touched on a portion of this. This section, Section 4, will be where we list these bonds and guarantees. Again, the perimeter buffer by phase must be planted ahead of the permit for the first building. When woodlands exist, the perimeter buffer and protection area shall be protected and marked prior to the notice to proceed. That's going to be the protective fence. The developer is responsible for all the stakes, guide wires, and protective fencing that goes in the beginning. Performance bond or other guarantee to cover the perimeter buffer in the amount of 125% or $50,000, whichever is greater, of the cost of the installation and value of the replacement plantings. All guarantees for the perimeter existed or planted will be for 2 years. And then we talk about perimeter buffer maintenance in Section 5, defines the responsibility for the health and survival of the buffer. We talked about this already. Developer will be responsible for the survival of the buffer for 2 years. Perpetual maintenance of the buffer will be recorded, and there will be a restrictive covenant. These are all things, Mr. Riley, back to your point earlier about the county having the ability to go in and enforce. These are things that we feel that will help us do that. Right now, we don't have those mechanisms in place, or if we do, they're not as strong as this ordinance purports to be. So we're going to try to boost our ability to ensure that enforcement is there.
But if you don't have compliance, what's your recourse?
Thank you for that segue into the next section.
I knew it.
We'll talk about fines in a minute, but tree mitigation. So mistakes happen on purpose or not, and perimeter buffers are affected by mistakes. and we need to make sure that if mistakes happen, what do we do to mitigate the trees that are affected. So we put a tree mitigation section in this proposal. The tree mitigation will be required when the buffer and protection area or existing woodlands is damaged without authorization. So if the guy mistakenly drives over the fence into the area and clears out some trees, what do we require? Well, this is what we're talking about here. We're not sure how that's going to happen now that we're requiring a fence to be put in place, but hopefully this fence will prevent that. But if it doesn't, then we're going to say that you've got to go out and hire a licensed professional to come up with a plan. The tree mitigation replacement will be at the rate of 3 trees for every 1 tree removed or damaged. All trees and shrubs will again meet the standards that are listed in our plans. An act of God or natural causes is exempt. Trees do die, trees do fall down, and if you need to go in and remove a tree, whether it be by some kind of mechanical means or otherwise, working with the Planning and Zoning Department, you'll be allowed to do that. And then,
Can I ask, before you get to
please.
that? Remind me, is there any language in the existing code or proposed language in this new code about the type of species of vegetation? Are we going to do indigenous species or just anything?
That's a great question. And you will see in this proposal that we use the term local and native species. Okay. And the reason we haven't been able to come up with a standard list of native species is because it has become very difficult between 2 or 3 state agencies to have a list of native species native to Delaware. I would go so far as saying I think some lists exist, but I don't know that it's the official state list of native species. So instead of waiting for that, we've just used the term native and local species. Of course, non-native or invasive species would not be allowed.
What does local species mean?
I can assist with that one.
Does that mean it's a Warden's Garden store?
Yeah. Go ahead, Mr. Whitehouse.
Local means local to the state of Delaware. So, and there are lists of species that are circulated. There is no one singular list, but native and local essentially mean to the state. So.
And then keep in mind that where Mr. Lawson was getting to was that landscape plan requirement. You know, we do have that the types of planting are going to have to be, identified by a licensed landscape architect, certified arborist, certified nursery professional, licensed forester, or something along those lines. So, the professionals would make that determination. Again, it's one of those things when we started drafting this, well, that's easy. There's got to be a list of these trees. Well, not so much. There is one in Newcastle County, but it was literally like pages and pages and pages long with all sorts of different variables, and it was just entirely too cumbersome for us to try to implement. And I think the Department of Agriculture didn't have one, which we thought they would. Anyhow, we made the effort, and it's just there's not something that's really usable out there. So that was a long answer to a short question. There's no list. We'll rely on the professionals. So.
There are certain agencies have certain lists, but it's not the official list. So which list do we point to say official? We got away from that by just saying local and native. You would be interested to know there is a committee form that Mr. Costello serves on to come up with a list of native species so that the state only plants native species on their properties. That list is being developed. So maybe we'll have a list in the future. As of right now, we're using the terminology local and native.
Will you amend the code and plug that list into the code?
Perhaps.
Okay.
Perhaps. It would be great if we were working off the same list for every agency, but to date, we don't have that one defined list, believe it or not. Another learning point in this whole exercise. Okay,
What a novel idea to have a...
This is Mr. Hudson's violation and penalty section. This section defines the penalties for violations of these new requirements. The penalties may be applied to a person, landowner, HOA, or developer It's not always the developer that does bad deeds. There are HOAs that have affected their perimeter buffers and perhaps not put them back the way that they were initially approved. A fine of $10,000 per quarter acre per rata of disturbance to the perimeter buffer and/or protection area may be imposed. That's the same amount of fine that we have in the Resource Buffer Ordinance. A tree mitigation plan for the disturbance will be required. And then to Mr. Riley's point earlier, all building permits, zoning permits, and inspections will be held until tree mitigation is completed and approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission.
Well, that's the big one, but
That's the real hammer that we have. Besides the fine, we don't necessarily want to fine someone, but if you're stopped in your tracks, if you cannot build, you don't get inspections anymore, and everything halts until this is fixed, that is a big incentive, we think, for developers in that context.
But it says may be imposed, doesn't say will be.
Well, everyone's innocent until proven guilty, so we've got to be able to.
Well, assuming they're proven guilty, I mean.
Then, without question, we can withhold permits and inspections immediately. We do that on a daily
And whose
basis.
judgment would it be that it may or may not be imposed?
It's written now. This is all through the Planning and Zoning Department and the Constable's Office, and then eventually the Director of Planning and Zoning, and then Planning and Zoning Commission. If things are happening immediately on the ground where we can't wait for sort of a commission review, then we send the constable out, and under their judgment, they would issue a notice of violation and a stop order on activities out there. That happens now. This would codify that authority under this context of protecting the perimeter buffer.
And would all fines have to be paid as well before permits could be issued?
We can make sure that's written in so that it's clear. Again, the fining capability of the county needs to be very clear in our ordinances. So this is just a very generalized way of saying we're going to fine you if you create a problem and violate what we impose. We'll make sure that it's clear, and the process is clear too. That if there is a violation, they know what to expect. Yeah. As I mentioned before, this is already in the code as it relates to the resource buffer protection. So if you have a problem, if there's a violation with the resource buffer, these are the same steps that take place right now. So there's some similarity and some consistency.
Right.
Okay. So that concludes staff's recommendations for this update. In summary, the document that we handed out today that's on the website and in the packet, this is our roadmap for the ordinance drafting. Unless I hear any voice of concern today from you all, that's what we're going to do, is instruct the county attorneys to start drafting this ordinance, and then come back to you with official introduction.
Is there a potential timeline?
Well, marijuana ordinance, accessory dwelling ordinance. We will ask him to proceed with haste.
Yeah, and we've done most of the heavy lifting with this outline. What we're going to have to do is go through, so we don't have to draft it from scratch, but there's a lot of existing language that deals with our current perimeter buffer requirements that we'll have to delete. And as one of the things that we talked about early on is that the current language is oddly buried in our definitions. There's requirements within the definitions, which is a really odd place for them. We're going to reorganize a little better, pull it out of there, put it somewhere else in the code so it makes sense as a requirement, not just a definition. But I'll get going on it with all due haste with everything else we have going on. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you,
No
sir.
objection?
I don't hear
Okay.
any, so you're good.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Now you report.